The air inside the first-class cabin was thick with a special kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, but the hushed, expensive calm of people who had paid a premium for peace. Soft, blue lighting ran along the edges of the ceiling, making the polished wood and cream-colored leather of the seats feel warm and inviting. Outside the small oval windows, the sprawling airport bustled with a chaotic energy that felt a world away. Inside, the only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the soft rustle of a newspaper page, and the distant, muffled clatter of the pre-flight preparations on the tarmac. It was a bubble of comfort, a temporary escape from the noise of everyday life. Tucked into a window seat about halfway down, the wide cabin was a man who seemed to have mastered the art of becoming invisible. He was dressed in clothes that had seen better days, a simple, dark t-shirt that was slightly faded, and comfortable jeans that were frayed just a bit at the hem. His dark hair was unruly, as if he had run his hands through it one too many times, and his face, though handsome in a familiar sort of way, was etched with a deep-seated weariness. He didn't look like a movie star or a business tycoon. He looked like a guy who just wanted to get from point A to point B without any fuss. This was Keanu Reeves, a face recognized by millions across the globe, but in this moment he was just another traveler, hoping to sink into the plush seat and disappear for the next several hours. He stared out the window, watching the baggage handlers throw luggage onto a conveyor belt with a detached sort of focus, his mind a million miles away from the luxury surrounding him. He had a small, worn backpack tucked under the seat in front of him. Its contents a mystery, but its presence suggesting a life of practicality over flash. This fragile piece was suddenly and violently shattered by a new arrival. A man strode down the aisle, not so much walking as owning the space he occupied. He was in his late 50s, perhaps, with a face that seemed permanently set in a look of stern judgment. His suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, a deep navy fabric that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was perfectly pressed, not a single crease out of place. On his wrist, a heavy, gleaming watch caught the cabin light with every sharp, aggressive gesture he made. He wasn't just a passenger. He was an announcement. He barked into his phone, his voice cutting through the calm like a foghorn. "No, listen to me," he commanded, his voice booming in the small space. "I don't care what the preliminary report says. You tell them that is not acceptable. Not acceptable at all. I want a new proposal on my desk by the time I land. Do you understand?" He didn't wait for an answer before ending the call with a sharp stab of his finger. He continued his pacing in the aisle, forcing a flight attendant who was trying to help an elderly woman to press herself against the seats to avoid being knocked over. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. To him, they were just part of the scenery, obstacles in the path of his own importance. Finally, he seemed to locate his designated seat, which happened to be directly across the aisle from the quiet man by the window. He flopped into it with a heavy sigh of annoyance, as if the very act of sitting was a great inconvenience. He immediately began drumming his expensive fingers on the armrest, his eyes scanning the cabin with a critical, dismissive gaze. He was a man accustomed to a world that moved at his command and catered to his every whim. This flight, this moment of stillness, was an irritation to him. A flight attendant, a young woman with a bright, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, approached him cautiously. "Sir, may I get you something to drink before we take off?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. He looked her up and down, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Champagne," he said, not as a request but as a demand. "And make sure it's the good stuff. Not whatever you normally serve in here?" He waved a dismissive hand at her, already looking past her, his attention flitting around the cabin as if searching for something else to be displeased with. The flight attendant's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she nodded and moved away, her back straight with practiced professionalism. The man in the suit shifted in his seat, his expensive clothes rustling loudly. He glanced over at the man by the window, who was still staring peacefully outside. For a brief moment, a look of pure contempt crossed the loud man's face. He saw the simple clothes, the tired posture, and he saw nothing but a failure, someone who didn't belong in this world of luxury and power. He sniffed loudly, a sound of disgust, and turned his head away, already bored and ready for the world to entertain him. The quiet bubble of the cabin had been popped, and now the air was thick with a tension that had everything to do with one man's need to be the biggest, loudest, and most important person in the room. The low hiss of the air conditioning was the only sound that broke the heavy silence as the main cabin door was sealed with a firm, final thud. It was a sound that signaled the end of the waiting and the beginning of the journey. For most, it was a welcome transition, a moment to finally settle in. But for the man in the expensive suit, it was like the starting gun on a race he was already losing. The confined space of the airplane cabin, which was meant to be a haven of control, now felt like a cage. His world was one of schedules and demands, of people jumping to do his bidding. But here, strapped into a seat, he was just another passenger. And the feeling chafed him. A moment later, the captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers, calm and professional, welcoming them aboard and detailing the flight time. The man in the suit barely listened, his eyes fixed on the flight attendants who were now moving through the cabin for their final checks. One of them, the same young woman who had taken his champagne order, was making her way down the aisle with a quiet efficiency. She moved with a grace that belied the pressure of her job, her eyes scanning each row. Her hands instinctively checking that overhead bins were securely latched. The plane began a slow, lumbering pushback from the gate, the gentle groan of the machinery vibrating through the floor. This was the signal for the crew to begin their preparations for takeoff. The attendant, whose name tag was barely visible in the dim light, started her rounds from the front of the first-class section. She was offering headphones and small amenity kits, a simple courtesy that was part of the premium service. Her path was methodical, row by row, a quiet procession of politeness in the opulent cabin. She soon reached the row where the quiet man was sitting. He had pulled a worn, soft beanie over his unruly hair and was now looking at a small screen built into the seat in front of him, though he hadn't selected anything to watch. He seemed to be just using the gentle glow as a distraction. As the attendant approached, he looked up, his eyes a little distant but not unfriendly. "Headphones, sir?" she asked, her voice a soft, professional murmur. He offered a small, tired smile. "No, thank you. I'm good," he replied, his voice quiet and calm. "But could I possibly just get a glass of water when you have a moment?" "Of course, sir," she said, her own smile becoming a little more genuine in response to his simple politeness. "I'll be right back with that." The exchange was brief, lasting no more than 10 seconds. It was a perfectly normal interaction between a passenger and a crew member. But the man in the suit, seated just across the aisle, had witnessed the entire thing. To him, it was not normal. It was an injustice. He had been snapping his fingers, trying to catch an attendant's eye for what felt like an eternity, and this man who looked like he should be cleaning the plane instead of flying in it, gets immediate attention. The logic of it was infuriating. He saw the attendant's smile, the genuine warmth in it that she had not shown him, and a hot wave of resentment washed over him. He watched as she walked away, heading towards the galley to get the water. His leg began to bounce up and down, a frantic, nervous energy radiating from him. He checked his expensive watch for the third time in as many minutes, as if the hands were moving too slowly, personally mocking his impatience. The world was full of little systems, little hierarchies, and he had always been at the top of them. First in line, first served, first heard. That was the natural order of things. But here in this floating tube the order was broken. A man in a faded t-shirt was being treated with more respect than a man in a bespoke suit. It was an insult to everything he stood for. A few moments later, the attendant returned. She first stopped at the quiet man's row and handed him a simple glass of water with ice. He took it with another quiet, "Thank you," his eyes already drifting back towards the window as the plane taxied towards the runway. The simple act of gratitude, the quiet dignity of it, seemed to only fuel the suit's anger. He saw it not as politeness, but as weakness. Finally, the attendant turned her attention to him. Her professional mask was firmly back in place. "Sir, are you all set for takeoff?" she asked, her voice neutral. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous hiss that was meant to be intimidating. "It's about time," he said, his eyes narrowed. "I've been trying to get someone's attention since I sat down. I see how it works around here. You serve the people who look like they need a handout first, and the people who actually pay for this service have to wait?" The attendant froze for a fraction of a second, her smile faltering. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was a special kind of venom in this man's voice that was particularly unpleasant. She took a quiet, steadying breath, her training kicking in. "I apologize if you felt you were waiting, sir," she said, her tone carefully measured. "I was completing my pre-flight checks. I am here to assist you now." Her apology was for his feeling, not for her actions, a subtle distinction that was lost on him in his rage. He just scoffed and waved a dismissive hand, turning his head to stare out the window, his jaw clenched tight. The spark was no longer just a spark. It had been fanned into a small, but determined, flame. His anger was no longer a general frustration with the world. It now had a target. He glanced sideways at the quiet man who was now sipping his water peacefully, completely unaware of the storm of contempt brewing just a few feet away. The man in the suit felt a surge of righteous indignation. He was going to make sure everyone in this cabin understood the proper order of things, one way or another. The roar of the engines grew from a deep hum to a powerful, gut-shaking thunder that vibrated through the floor and up into the very bones of every passenger on the plane. The massive aircraft began its slow, deliberate roll down the taxiway, a gentle sway that felt like a giant rocking itself awake. Outside the windows, the blurry world of the airport terminal slid by, replaced by the concrete expanse of the runway stretching out into the distance. For most, this was a moment of routine excitement, the final step before the magic of flight. But for the man in the expensive suit, the building noise and pressure only fueled the fire that was already burning inside him. He sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. The glass of champagne he had been given sat untouched on his tray table, the bubbles having long since died. He wasn't thinking about the destination or the purpose of his trip. His entire world had shrunk to the few feet of space that separated him from the quiet man by the window. The injustice of it all festered in his mind, replaying on a loop. The attendant's smile, the quiet request for water, the simple, unassuming way the man carried himself. To the man in the suit, these weren't just actions. They were symbols of a world gone wrong, a world where respect was given freely instead of being earned through power and wealth. He glanced over again. The quiet man had now closed his eyes, his head resting gently against the side of the cabin as the plane picked up speed. He looked completely at peace, a stark contrast to the storm of rage brewing beside him. This peacefulness was the final insult. How dare he be so calm? How dare he exist in this space of luxury without a care in the world, without the proper deference, without even the appearance of success? The man in the suit's mind raced, painting a picture of this stranger's life. He probably lived in a tiny apartment, worked some meaningless job, and this flight was probably a one-time fluke, a lottery win, or a gift from a relative he'd leached off. He didn't belong here. He was an imposter, and it was up to him, the man in the suit, to expose him. The plane's engines screamed to their full power as the pilot released the brakes. The force of the acceleration pressed everyone deep into their seats. It was a physical weight, a tangible feeling of being pushed back, and for the man in the suit, it felt like the world was pushing back against his own sense of order. This was it. This was the moment. The plane was hurtling down the runway, a point of no return, and he felt the same unstoppable urge to unleash the words that were choking him. He had to say something. He had to restore the natural balance as the nose of the plane lifted off the ground, and the wheels left the earth with a gentle bump. The man in the suit leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise of the engines and the hushed awe of the other passengers. He didn't care who heard. In fact, he wanted everyone to hear. "Unbelievable," he began, his voice dripping with a venomous sarcasm that was loud enough for the rows in front and behind to clearly hear. "You see a guy like that, looks like he just rolled out of a dumpster. And he gets treated like royalty. He gestured with a sharp, dismissive jerk of his chin towards the quiet man, who opened his eyes at the sound of the voice. The man in the suit continued, his words spitting out like poison. Probably some washed-up roadie for a second-rate band. Can't they staff these flights with people who don't look so utterly defeated? It's bad for the brand. It drags the whole experience down for the rest of us who actually belong here. A tense, heavy silence fell over the surrounding seats. The low roar of the engines seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the shocking weight of his words. The flight attendant who was strapped into her nearby jump seat froze, her face a mask of horror and professional dilemma. She couldn't get up, couldn't intervene. She could only watch, her hands clenched in her lap. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some staring openly at the man in the suit with looks of disbelief and disgust, others pointedly looking away, pretending they hadn't heard a thing. But their rigid postures gave them away. The quiet man by the window slowly turned his head. He didn't look angry or embarrassed or even surprised. He just looked at the source of the noise, his dark eyes calm and clear. He took in the man's flushed face, his expensive suit, his aura of furious entitlement. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no sign that he was a famous actor used to public attention. He was just a man observing another man having a very public, very ugly tantrum. For a long moment, he just held the man's gaze. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity, but something close to it. It was the look you might give a child who is screaming for a toy he can't have, a look of profound, sad understanding. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I feel sorry for you." Then, the corner of his mouth turned up into the smallest, most fleeting of smiles. It wasn't a happy smile or a sarcastic smile. It was just a simple, quiet acknowledgement. And then, just as slowly, he turned his head back to the window, dismissing the man and his entire tirade as if it were nothing more than a fly buzzing at the window pane. The lack of any reaction, the complete and total indifference, was more powerful than any comeback could have ever been. The man in the suit was left hanging, his venomous words hanging in the air with no target. He had expected a fight, an argument, a tearful denial, something he could grab onto and twist, but he got nothing. He was shouting into a void. A hot, sickening feeling began to replace his righteous anger. He felt a flicker of doubt, a creeping sense that he had just made a complete and utter fool of himself in front of everyone. He huffed loudly, "Whatever," and slumped back into his seat, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. He stared straight ahead, his face burning with a humiliation that was far worse than any slight he had ever felt before. The plane was soaring through the clouds now, high above the world, but the man in the suit had never felt smaller. The silence that followed the man's outburst was heavier, and more suffocating than the air pressure changes as the plane climbed into the sky. It was a living, breathing thing, filling the first-class cabin and pressing down on the man in the expensive suit. The roar of the engines, which had been a deafening thunder just moments before, now seemed distant and muffled, as if the world had been placed under a glass dome. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. But when he dared to glance around, they all quickly looked away, staring at their screens or out the windows, their feigned indifference more damning than any open stare. He was an island of shame in a sea of quiet judgment. His face felt hot, a prickly, burning heat that started in his neck and crept up to his ears. He had wanted attention, to be seen as the most important person in the room, but not like this. He had wanted respect, but had only earned contempt. He sat rigidly, his arms still crossed over his chest, a defensive posture that felt flimsy and childish. He stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in front of him, his eyes unfocused. His mind was a chaotic storm of replayed moments. He saw the quiet man's calm, pitying smile. He heard his own voice, shrill and ugly, spitting words that now seemed to echo back at him with a hollow, pathetic ring. Washed-up roadie, utterly defeated. The phrases which had felt so powerful and righteous in his head now just sounded petty and cruel. He was a bully. A loud, obnoxious bully who had just been publicly put in his place, not with a fight, but with a simple, devastating turn of a head. The quiet man hadn't needed to say a word. His silence had been the loudest and most effective retort. The fastened seatbelt sign pinged off, its soft chime a signal that normal life could resume. A flight attendant unbuckled herself from her jump seat. It was the same young woman he had berated earlier. She stood up, smoothed her uniform, and her eyes immediately found the man in the suit. For a split second, their gazes met. He saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear or deference. It was a cold, flat disappointment. She looked right through him as if he were nothing more than a piece of turbulent air the plane had just passed through. Then she turned and walked towards the quiet man's row, the man in the suit's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched her, a desperate hope flickering inside him. Maybe she was coming to apologize. Maybe she was going to offer him a drink on the house, a peace offering to soothe his bruised ego. He needed something, anything, to restore the balance of power, to make him feel like he was in control again, but she didn't even glance his way. She stopped at the quiet man's row and leaned down, her voice a low, respectful murmur that the man in the suit couldn't quite hear over the hum of the engines. The quiet man looked up from his window and gave her a small, genuine smile. He shook his head slightly and said something back. The interaction was brief, warm, and completely professional. It was the exact opposite of the interaction she had just had with the loud man. The sight of it was like a physical blow. He felt a surge of fresh anger, hot and sharp. He opened his mouth to call out, to demand her attention, to remind her who was paying her salary. "Excuse me," he started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, I could use another drink over here." The flight attendant straightened up and turned to face him. Her smile was gone, replaced by a polite, blank mask. It was the face of a professional who had dealt with 1,000 difficult passengers and had learned to build a wall around her feelings. She walked over to his seat, her steps measured and deliberate. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice perfectly neutral. "How may I help you?" He was about to snap at her, to demand to know why he was being ignored, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was a look of profound, weary patience. She was waiting for him to make a fool of himself again. "I'll have another champagne," he said, his voice suddenly weak, all the bluster gone out of it. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone not changing at all. She turned to walk away, but then paused and looked back at him. There was no warmth in her expression, only a chilling formality. "I do apologize again for any delay you may have felt earlier when we boarded," she said, her words carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "My priority was to ensure Mr. Reeves had everything he needed for a comfortable flight. He's had a very long week." The name hung in the air between them, shimmering with an unspoken power. Mr. Reeves, the man in the suit, blinked. His brain stuttered, refusing to process the information at first. Reeves, he looked past the flight attendant, his eyes locking onto the quiet man by the window. The tired face, the unruly hair, the kind eyes. It was like a puzzle piece suddenly clicking into place in his mind. He saw the face from the movie posters, the billboards, the action figures his nephew used to play with. He saw the face from the news, the actor famous for his kindness, for his quiet generosity, for being one of the most decent people in Hollywood. It wasn't a roadie. It wasn't a failure. It was Keanu Reeves, a wave of hot, sickening shame, so intense it was almost physical, washed over him. It started in his stomach and rose up into his throat, leaving a bitter, acrid taste. He had just insulted Keanu Reeves. He, a man whose only claim to fame was a big bank account and an even bigger ego, had publicly humiliated a man beloved by millions. He looked around the cabin and saw the other passengers who had overheard the exchange. They weren't just looking at him with disgust anymore. They were looking at him with pity. It was 1,000 times worse. He was a joke. A pathetic, small-minded joke. The flight attendant gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and walked away, leaving him to drown in his own humiliation. The invisible walls of his first-class bubble suddenly felt like a cage made of glass, and everyone was pointing and laughing at the animal trapped inside. His power, his money, his expensive suit, His gleaming watch, all of it, felt worthless, cheap, and tawdry. He had built his entire identity on being better than other people, and in one single, catastrophic moment he had proven he was the worst of them all. For the rest of the long flight he was silent. He didn't move. He didn't call for another drink. He just sat there, a prisoner in his own seat, the name Reeves echoing in his head, a constant damning reminder of his own profound, and now very public, ignorance. The long hours of the flight stretched out before the man in the suit like a sentence. Time, which he usually tried to control and conquer, now became his tormentor. Each minute that ticked by on the digital display above his seat was another minute. He had to live with the crushing weight of his own actions. The luxury cabin, which had been his kingdom, his territory, now felt like a prison. The soft leather of his seat seemed to hold him in place, a constant reminder of the status he had so foolishly thrown away. The gentle hum of the engines was no longer a sound of power and progress. It was a monotonous drone that echoed the hollowness he felt inside. He didn't move. He didn't call for a flight attendant. He didn't watch a movie or listen to music. He just sat there, staring blankly ahead, his mind a relentless loop of his own arrogance. He saw himself striding down the aisle, barking into his phone. He felt the surge of indignation when the quiet man got served first. He heard his own voice, loud and ugly, spitting those hateful words into the sterile cabin air. Each replay was a fresh stab of humiliation. He had built a life on a foundation of being respected, or more accurately, being feared. He was the man who could end careers with a single email, the man whose presence silenced a room. But here, in this confined space 30,000 feet in the air, he had been exposed. He wasn't powerful. He was just a loud, cruel man with an expensive suit. He risked a glance at the quiet man, at Mr. Reeves. He was just sitting there, occasionally looking out the window, sometimes dozing. He was a portrait of peace. He hadn't looked over once. He hadn't whispered to the other passengers or pointed. He hadn't sought any kind of revenge. He had simply accepted the insult and then moved on, as if it were no more significant than a fly landing on his arm. This complete lack of engagement was the most profound punishment of all. It showed the man in the suit that he was not even worthy of anger or contempt. He was nothing. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with their quiet efficiency, serving a meal that looked and smelled exquisite. The man in the suit barely noticed when his was placed in front of him. He just stared at the plate, the carefully arranged food looking like a foreign object. He had no appetite. His stomach was a tight knot of shame. He saw the same young flight attendant who had revealed the actor's identity. She moved with the same professional grace, but when her eyes passed over his row, they lingered for a fraction of a second. A look of cool pity in their depths before moving on. She wasn't being rude. She was just treating him as he had made himself. A problem to be managed, a sad footnote to an otherwise pleasant flight. As the hours passed, a strange new feeling began to bubble up under the shame. It was a desperate, gnawing need to fix it. He couldn't let this be the end of the story. He couldn't walk off this plane and leave this festering wound behind. The thought of stepping into the airport, a place where he was used to moving with confidence, and feeling this way was unbearable. The thought of this story being told, of him being that guy, was a fate worse than any business failure. He had to do something. He had to atone. The captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing the initial descent into their destination. The gentle change in pressure was a physical jolt to the man in the suit. This was it. Time was running out. His heart began to pound in his chest, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He was more nervous now than he had been before any major business deal or courtroom appearance. This was different. This wasn't about winning. It was about salvaging a tiny piece of his own soul. As the plane began its final approach, the seatbelt sign pinged on. The flight attendants made their final rounds, ensuring everyone was secure. The man in the suit watched them, his hands trembling slightly. He knew what he had to do. The thought of it was terrifying, but the thought of not doing it was worse. He waited until the plane had touched down with a gentle bump and was taxiing to the gate. The familiar chime signaled that it was safe to move around. People began to stir, opening overhead bins, gathering their belongings, the low hum of conversation filling the cabin. This was his chance. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it took all the energy he had left, the man in the suit unbuckled his seatbelt. He felt clumsy, his limbs heavy and awkward. He stood up, his expensive suit feeling like a costume he was wearing for a role he was no longer qualified to play. He took a hesitant step into the aisle, and then another. The short distance to the quiet man's row feeling like the longest walk of his life. The quiet man. Keanu Reeves was putting a simple, worn backpack over his shoulders, looking no different than when he had boarded. "Just a tired traveler ready to be home, Mr. Reeves?" The man in the suit began, his voice barely a whisper. It cracked with the strain, a thin, reedy sound that was unrecognizable to his own ears. I am so sorry." Keanu Reeves turned, and the man in the suit was struck by the look in his eyes. There was no anger, no smugness, no triumph. There was only a calm, patient curiosity, as if he were waiting to hear what the man had to say. "What I said earlier. There is no excuse," the man in the suit continued, the words tumbling out in a rush of nervous energy. "I was an arrogant fool. It was inexcusable." He couldn't meet the actor's gaze, his eyes fixed on the worn fabric of the backpack strap. Keanu Reeves didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the man, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slight, almost dismissive wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it," he said softly. His voice was quiet, but it carried a surprising warmth and sincerity. "Really, it's a long flight. We all have our moments." He offered a small, genuine smile that completely disarmed the man in the suit. It wasn't the smile of a movie star. It was the smile of a regular person, a kind and understanding smile. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something better. It was grace. It was the act of letting it go, of refusing to carry the burden of someone else's anger. In that simple moment, Keanu Reeves had shown more true power than the man in the suit had ever displayed in his entire life. As the plane doors opened and the fresh air of the gate wafted into the cabin, Keanu Reeves gave a final, polite nod and shouldered his bag. He turned and melted into the anonymous stream of passengers, just another traveler disappearing into the crowd. The man in the suit stood there for a long moment, letting the other passengers file past him. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it felt different now. It was lighter. It was no longer the crushing weight of shame, but the heavier, more solid weight of a lesson learned. He straightened his tie, a familiar old habit, but it felt different this time. It wasn't an act of arrogance. It was just an attempt to compose himself. He stepped off the plane and into the bright lights of the airport terminal. A humbler man, the expensive suit on his back feeling heavier than it ever had before. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like it actually fit.